My name is Andrew Rádriguez Cálderón, and I'm a computational journalist at the Marshall Project, which is a nonprofit newsroom that covers criminal justice and immigration.
My name is Wei-Hua, and I am a data reporter at the Marshall Project, which means essentially that I use numbers to tell stories about the criminal justice system. Instead of telling a story of one person, data is able to help us to tell a story about a system and to prove that there is systematic failures because we can go beyond just stories of one. And it also allows us to find sources behind the data points whose stories really embodies the horrific injustice that we see in a lot of, say, criminal justice data that we have analyzed.
A data reporter does a lot of the same work as a computational journalist. You do traditional reporting, you talk to sources, you develop relationships, but you're also always thinking about, is there any place where data might exist, where record keeping might happen that I can access to be able to get a deeper perspective on an issue? A computational journalist does all of those things, but you are also developing technological infrastructure to be able to scale some of these projects. So, for example, you might receive thousands and thousands of rows of data from the government. Maybe you're thinking about getting data on a recurring basis, so every month you're going to get thousands of rows. How do I set up an infrastructure that doesn't make it complicated for me to process these data sets every single time? Can I automate any part of the process? And then how do I communicate these results to everyone else on the team? Because journalism is a team sport. You're often working with a lot of people. You're not just working on your own. And then lastly, how do I make this information available to the public? And so that's a really big part of my job right now at the Marshall Project. My typical workflow as a computational journalist at the Marshall Project can take at least two directions. One is that as a team, we've decided that we want to work on something, and the other can be that some other person on another team or maybe an editor brings us something, and oftentimes it's editorial projects, but at the Marshall Project we also build products, and so it might also be a product. An example of the first would be that perhaps we've been looking at crime statistics coming from the FBI, and we decided that we wanted to look into a particular issue based on something that's happening in the news. And so we'll start processing the data that's coming in from the FBI. Maybe we'll find a story and then we develop it, and then we'll think about, is there anybody at the news organization that we can work with that can add a skill that we don't have, or maybe take on a part of the task that we are not responsible for? Oftentimes that's the writing or some part of the reporting. Then when someone brings us something from another department, it can vary. Sometimes someone just comes and says to us, can you analyze this data really quickly, or can you clean this data? I want to look at something. And other times it's a longer term effort. Maybe we're working for months and we're constantly creating a feedback loop where as we're learning something from the data analysis, we're giving it back to the reporting team, and the reporting team is telling us what they're seeing and what they're hearing, and we create a system. And oftentimes those systems are supported by actual technologies, and so there are a couple of different technologies that we use to be able to make it easier to create those feedback loops.
Data is really important in social issues for a number of ways. I think the most important for us is data is a signifier of power and what powerful people are interested, powerful institutions are interested in gathering. For example, when we talk about the criminal justice system, it's easy to figure out how many people are incarcerated. It's easy to figure out what kind of charges, what kind of crime they were accused of that led them in prison. But it's extremely difficult to figure out how many of those people have children. How many children in the United States have at least one parent who's incarcerated? Because that's not something that the federal government or state or local government have invested the kind of energy to gather data on. And I think as a reporter, those gaps are really good, really important stories, really good ways for us to fill and for us to provide a service. And also, at the end of the day, data is information. It helps us to understand anything at scale. And in the criminal justice system, a profound issue that we face when analyzing with data is criminal justice data have a lot of inherent bias in it. For example, when we are looking at how many crimes took place in New York City, we're really looking at how many crimes were reported to the police. We know that in a lot of wealthier neighborhoods, police are not patrolling as hard, so they're probably not picking up as many, say, drug crimes as they would in parts of Bronx or Harlem. We also know that a lot of people simply don't report crimes that happen to them to the police, with the feeling that the police is not going to do anything that's useful. So all of those information are not being captured in crime data as we see it. So it's really important for us to not only report with data in social issues, but also understand the failure of data as well.
For a lot of computational projects, you'll not only be working on the data on the back end, but you're also going to be thinking about what it's going to look like, because you want to make sure that the information is easily accessible to the public. And if you can, do some kind of user research beforehand to know who's going to use it and how, and talk to them about what you're building, because you might think that people are going to use your information in a certain way, but the reality is that oftentimes our assumptions about the way that people use things are wrong. Recently, I worked on a project, and we just published this a couple of weeks ago, where we systematically requested banned book lists from prisons across the country in all 50 states. We were only able to get 25 because some states don't collect banned book lists, but for those that we do, every single list had a slightly different form. And so I had to set up an infrastructure to be able to clean every single one of these lists in an automated way, to reconcile them, to bring them together, to then create a single data set that we could put into a product that now has been visualized in the form of a table that anyone can search on the website to see what the banned books are in their state. We're planning on sustaining this effort and maintaining it, so every few months we might request a list again. So I needed to think, how can I set up the code to not only clean these lists and reconcile them, but to make it easy to plug in any new lists or maybe account for changes. And so you really have to do a lot of forward thinking. Some of the tools that I used to do that were Python, Google Spreadsheets as well, which you can connect through an API or through a URL into Python. And then for the front end, it's a lot of JavaScript and HTML and kind of the typical front-end web development tools.
How to use data to write stories or to create better transparency in countries that doesn't have as much of press freedom or freedom of speech as the United States. That's a question that I think a lot about, because I grew up in China and now still have a lot of friends who, maybe study in the US and return to China to become a journalist. They operate in an inherently different political system, and again, if you think back about the power of data, it's the power of telling a story of many people instead of one people. It's the power of telling a story about the system. A data set that we analyze doesn't have to be gathered and released by the government. A lot of great reporting done with people who went and gathered their own data, pulled their own documents. And I would imagine that it would require a lot of thinking outside of the box and maneuvering very close to the red line to operate as a data journalist in a place with less freedom. And truly, I admire anyone who takes on the task.
What really excites me about the work that we do from a technical perspective are the possibilities of scale and of doing what we've been calling on the team generative journalism. So building something that isn't necessarily the big Pulitzer Prize winning project, but it's something small but functional that we know is going to serve a specific purpose, and then asking ourselves, what is our long-term plan for this, and how can we build tech infrastructure to be able to sustain an effort? And so, for example, we've partnered recently with Axios to do localized stories where we take data from the FBI's crime statistics and build small stories on a monthly or a bi-monthly basis. And so our contribution is to build the infrastructure that processes the data, that makes it easier for people on the ground and reporters, nonprofit groups, et cetera, to do additional reporting, to do transparency work based on that information. And so we take on the technological burden while other people can do the work that maybe they're more interested in, or that they're really good at, or that they have the resources for.
The data journalism we do at the Marshall Project is extremely collaborative. At the data team, we collaborate with other reporters. We also collaborate with reporters from other newsrooms. where we can bring in data analysis and power to visualize that, and our partners can bring in a lot of really important local context. After we read the story about the FBI, how 40% of the agencies failed to submit data to the FBI in 2021, it has sparked dozens local reportings across the country. We don't know if any agencies have switched because of the story or because of the local pressure, but we have been really enjoying seeing local news clips where the TV reporter printed out the news app that we have built, showed it to their local sheriff, and the sheriff said, this really calls into question about our logistics and will make us want to look at it further and want to change. Our thinking is criminal justice system is intensely local. We, the Marshall Project, couldn't write 18,000 stories, one for each local police agency. But using data, we are able to spark that debate and give tools and power to local news organizations and local activists to pick up that task on their own.
The most memorable story I worked on was a story that I worked on last year. We got a tip that the state of Colorado was releasing misinformation about voting rights for people who have a felony conviction. So in some of the DMVs, which is where you can get this voting information, as well as through the Department of State, on the form where your rights are stated, if you have a felony conviction, it said that you are not allowed to vote. But as of 2019, that was no longer the case, and you were eligible to vote and you could register. And the reason why that matters isn't just because of voting rights, but it's also because many people who have gone through the criminal justice system and have left it are really afraid of going back. And in the US, if you even just register to vote, that can be another felony conviction and can land you back in jail. And so we got this tip, we reported out the story. Even before the story published, the Department of State of Colorado said that they were updating their forms across 200 locations. And then we put together a comic strip with one of the sources from the story and his mother, who was the person who actually alerted us to this issue, and then distribute it to nonprofit centers across the state so that they could release this information to people in a form that wasn't just a story, that hopefully would be usable and functional for them and just easier and more fun to consume. After we released that, the Department of State recontacted us from the state of Colorado to ask us if they could use the comic strip to be able to make information available to their centers. Just the fact that that conversation even happened and that they felt that that was something that they could use and could serve cross purposes, I feel was really rewarding.
We really value our impact, the changes that we bring to the world, to the criminal justice system, as opposed to say how many eyeballs we get on a story and how many advertisement revenue we get out of it. And it's a truly special place because that really allows us to dig deep into the system and not to be tied down by the day-to-day daily pressure to produce.